Have you ever witnessed a moment so quiet, yet so powerful, it changed the entire mood of a plane? A young female soldier stood frozen in the aisle, humiliated after being told she didn't deserve her seat. No one spoke. No one moved, until a quiet man in a worn green jacket stood up and changed everything. But what no one knew was that soldier was the daughter of a 4-star general. And the man who stood up, he wasn't just any father traveling with his daughter. He was something far more extraordinary. Stay with us to discover the full story of courage, dignity, and the quiet power of doing what's right, even when no one else will. If you believe in kindness, in standing up for others, and in the kind of stories that heal, subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-feeling narratives like this one. And don't forget to like and share, because someone out there needs this story today. Now let's begin. The airport terminal hummed with the usual chaos of a late afternoon departure. Gate C-17 at Dallas-Fort Worth buzzed with announcements, rolling suitcases, and tired travelers clinging to their coffee cups. Among them, Clara Donovan stood quietly, her uniform still crisp despite the long day. She had just returned from her final debrief at Fort Cavazos, and in her hand, she held a single envelope, first-class boarding pass. Seat 3A. It wasn't just a seat, it was a gift. A farewell gesture from her father, General Blake Donovan, a man revered by many, feared by most, but to her, just Dad. He was too ill now to travel, let alone attend her final deployment ceremony. Cancer had hollowed out the giant she once clung to, but he still found the strength to surprise her with that small token, a moment of dignity, a place to sit tall. Before leaving the hospital, he had looked her in the eyes and said, "You keep your chin up, Clara. Doesn't matter what row you're in, doesn't matter who's watching. You remember who you are, and you walk proud." That memory echoed in her chest as she walked down the jet bridge. She stepped onto the aircraft, nodding politely to the flight attendants, and made her way through the clean navy blue aisle of the first-class cabin. The smell of synthetic leather mixed with citrus-scented disinfectant and the low hum of air vents greeted her. Her eyes found 3A, except someone was already in it. A large, balding man in a white button-up shirt reclined leisurely, crinkling a bag of chips, no Dynacrunch, and letting out a hearty laugh at something on his phone. His foot was stretched confidently across the leg space. Clara paused, glanced at her ticket again, then spoke politely. "Excuse me, sir. I believe this is my seat." The man barely looked up. "You must be mistaken, sweetheart," he said, smiling as if speaking to a confused child. "This one's mine." "Check again." "I did," Clara replied, her voice calm. 3A, that's me. That got his attention. He lowered his phone and stared at her uniform. "Oh, one of you." He chuckled almost with pity. "I see. Well, look, I fly a lot. First class has kind of become home for me. You'll probably be more comfortable in the back anyway." Clara blinked. "Sir, this isn't about comfort. This is my assigned seat." Passengers nearby began to glance up. One woman behind them lowered her Kindle. Another leaned in just slightly, sensing friction. But no one said anything. "Look, soldier," the man said, still smiling but now with a condescending edge. "You serve your country great. I appreciate it, really. But don't make a scene. Let's be reasonable here." Clara felt a burn rise in her chest. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, smooth, practiced, dismissive. The kind of tone that dressed itself in civility, but stripped you of dignity all the same. She took a breath. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not making a scene. I'm just asking you to move to the seat that's actually yours." His laugh this time was louder, braver, like he enjoyed the performance. "I bet you got that seat as some thank you for your service charity upgrade, didn't you? Don't worry, you're still a hero back there in coach." She stood silent, and that's when she heard a voice. Low, steady, Male. She's not the one making a scene. The voice came from a few rows back, every head turned. A tall man with long, slightly graying hair tied at the back, wearing a faded green military-style jacket, stepped out from the aisle. His presence was calm, not imposing, but there was a weight in the way he moved. He held the hand of a young girl with dark eyes and a small, stuffed bear dangling from her other hand. The girl tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, is everything okay?" He gave her a gentle nod, then turned toward Clara and the businessman. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man said, eyes locked on Charles Hale, though no name had yet been spoken. "This seat," he gestured to 3A with a calm hand, "belongs to the lady in uniform." "Not you." Charles leaned back in his seat, amused. "And who are you?" "The seat police. I'm just someone who doesn't like bullies and expensive shirts." Laughter this time from someone a few seats down. The tension cracked slightly. Charles scowled. "Look, I don't know what fantasy you think you're in, but this is none of your business, pal." The man didn't blink. "It became my business the moment you decided her uniform gave you permission to disrespect her." Clara stepped forward. "Sir, it's all right." "No, it's not," the man said gently, still not raising his voice. "You shouldn't have to handle this alone." There was something about the way he said it. Something familiar, grounded. Like he'd said it before, but in places far more dangerous than the cabin of a plane. Charles's face twisted with faux amusement. "You some kind of soldier too. Doesn't look like you've been deployed in a while." The girl next to the man looked up and whispered, "He was. A long time ago. But he doesn't talk about it much." The plane grew still. A few passengers exchanged glances. Then the man in green spoke again. "Some of us don't need medals to remember what matters." Charles opened his mouth, and then for the first time said nothing. Clara stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened, but feeling the shift in the cabin. The weight of silence now belonged to someone else. And somewhere in her chest, she heard her father's voice again. "Keep your chin up. Doesn't matter what row you're in." Today she was in row 3A, and someone, a stranger, had made sure she stayed there. The hum of the cabin returned slowly, like a wave retreating after an unexpected storm. People shifted in their seats, murmured softly, glanced at phones and overhead bins, pretending not to be rattled, but clearly moved. Clara Donovan stood silent, heart still racing, her boarding pass now crumpled slightly in her gloved hand. Charles Hale, the arrogant man in seat 3A, no longer smiled. Eventually, a flight attendant approached, poised, professional, but eyes watchful. She looked at Clara, then at the man in green still standing beside his daughter. "Everything all right here?" she asked. Clara nodded, voice low. "Yes, thank you." The attendant's eyes flicked to the empty seat a few rows back. "Sir, we have another seat available." But before she could finish, Charles Hale stood, his lips pressed tight. "Forget it," he muttered. "Let the soldier sit. It's not worth the press." He moved stiffly toward the back, without another word, dragging his expensive briefcase behind him like a broken flag. Clara stood still for a moment, before finally stepping into her rightful seat. She didn't look back, but her eyes did meet his, the man in green. He gave her a small nod, not grand, not performative, just respectful. Then, with a gentle tug of his daughter's hand, he turned and walked back to their row 7C and 7D. They were seated just a few feet behind her now, but Clara found herself glancing back once subtly just to study him. There was something calm about the man, not just in posture, but in energy. He had the kind of stillness you don't learn in civilian life, the kind born in noise and earned through silence. She didn't know why, but her breath slowed. The fire in her chest dimmed. She was grateful but curious. Who was he? Row 7 was unusually quiet. Daniel Brooks reclined his seat slightly, though he didn't close his eyes. He rarely did on planes. His daughter Bella nestled beside him, stuffed bear now tucked between her knees, looked up at him with bright eyes. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart." Why was that man mean to the soldier lady? Daniel took a long breath, then glanced down at her. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people think power comes from money, or the way they dress, or where they sit on a plane." She frowned. "But that's silly." "Yes, it is." He smiled at her, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Bella thought for a moment. Is she a real soldier? She is. And that man, is he going to be in trouble? Daniel shook his head. No, he's just someone who needed to be reminded of what respect looks like. She was quiet for a beat. Why didn't anyone else say anything? Daniel looked toward the front of the plane where Clara now sat, quietly, posture upright, eyes forward. Sometimes, he said, people stay quiet not because they agree with what's wrong, but because they forget they have the right to speak up. Bella tilted her head. Like in school, he chuckled. Exactly like in school. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm glad you remembered. Daniel exhaled. So was he. Clara tried to focus on the flight safety briefing, but her mind wandered. She'd dealt with disrespect before catcalls outside bars, assumptions in briefings, skepticism in training. She'd learned to carry herself taller, speak more firmly, give fewer reactions. But this had been different. There had been no shouting, no threats. Just a man who stood up, not with fists, but with quiet courage. She turned in her seat slightly, just enough to catch another glimpse of him. He looked tired, but not weak. Worn, but not bitter. His green jacket had seen better years, and his boots were scuffed, not stylish. Yet he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. She'd seen men like that before. Once. Years ago. Her father's men. The flight ascended smoothly, turbulence barely noticeable. Drinks were passed. Lights dimmed. Passengers settled into the lull of mid-air comfort. Daniel didn't sleep. He rarely did, especially on commercial flights. Too many years in transport aircraft sleeping with one eye open. Too many habits that never unlearned themselves. But as Bella drifted off her head, still resting against his arm, he finally let himself close his eyes. For a moment, until he heard a soft voice. So he opened them. Clara stood in the aisle just beside his row. Not rigid, not formal, just grateful. He straightened slightly. Yes, ma'am, she half smiled. I wanted to say thank you. You don't have to. I want to. Daniel gave a small nod. You deserve that seat, that's all. Clara hesitated. Most people wouldn't have said anything. He tilted his head, his voice as calm as ever. Most people don't have a little girl watching their every move. Clara followed his gaze to the sleeping Bella. She's beautiful, she said softly. She's my everything. There was a pause between them, one that wasn't awkward, just unspoken. Then Clara cleared her throat. You served. Daniel looked out the window. Used to. Branch. He hesitated, then looked back at her. Army. Special Forces. Long time ago. Clara's eyes flickered. Name's Clara. Clara Donovan. Daniel froze just slightly. A flick of tension at the jawline. A shift in the air. But his voice remained even. Daniel Brooks. Nice to meet you, Clara. She didn't miss the pause before he spoke, or the subtle lift of his shoulders afterward, as if adjusting the weight of memory. Donovan, he repeated softly. She nodded. My father's Blake Donovan. This time Daniel didn't hide the reaction. His eyes narrowed, but not in judgment, in recognition. Then he smiled just a little. General Donovan. Clara blinked. You knew him. Daniel leaned back in his seat, a far-off look passing through his eyes. I served under him once, a long time ago. Cobble. He was tough, but fair. Clara's voice dropped. He's sick now. Can't travel anymore. He gave me that first-class ticket as a gift. Daniel's gaze softened. He would. There was a pause again, this one heavier. Clara finally asked, "You never told me what made you stand up today." Daniel looked at Bella, then back at her. "Because silence is easy," he said. "And I've seen what silence allows." Clara swallowed hard. Then she nodded. And just like that, she returned to her seat, but with her heart changed. And behind her, Daniel Brooks sat quietly once again. But now, the mystery had begun to unravel. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs dimmed with a soft chime. Passengers leaned back, pulled out books, tapped at tablets. A few began to doze. But the air hadn't quite settled. Not for Clara, not for Daniel, and certainly not for the man who now sat, fuming in coach, stripped of his throne. Daniel Brooks sat still in seat 7C, back straight, arms gently crossed. He didn't need a newspaper or earbuds to distract him. His senses were sharp in a different way, tuned not to sound or motion, but to tone. And something in the cabin didn't feel done. He knew how silence could deceive. He'd seen it too often in the spaces between gunfire. Just because things were quiet didn't mean the threat had passed. Sometimes silence was just the storm taking a deep breath. He looked over at Bella, who was sketching quietly with a blunt pencil on the back of her coloring book. A tiny drawing of a soldier holding hands with a little girl had begun to take shape. Daniel smiled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Behind them, the whispering started. It began with 2 passengers near the rear galley. That was him, right? The guy who stood up, I think so. Never seen someone shut down a jerk like that without even raising his voice. A man across the aisle joined in, speaking to no one in particular. Was that really the soldier's seat? She didn't look like the first-class type. Daniel heard it all. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Years of combat had taught him how to listen between the words, how fear and envy slipped into conversations like water under doors. Clara, seated in 3A, heard it too. She closed her eyes, tried to focus on the rhythmic pulse of the engines, the cold air against her skin. But the echo of Charles Hale's laughter still clung to her ears like grease. She clenched the armrest. Her mind wandered back to the hospital room that morning, her father sunken into his blankets, but still managing a crooked grin as he handed her the ticket. "It's not the seat, Clara," he'd said. "It's the act of walking to it like you belong there." She hadn't even had time to hug him properly. The transport call had come too fast, but now that voice haunted her. Walk like you belong. She opened her eyes and glanced back just enough to catch Daniel in profile, steady alert, as if he too knew the air had changed again. Then it happened. Charles Hale stood up. He emerged from coach like a politician from a backroom deal, rumpled, but with false confidence freshly reapplied. His blazer was back on his shirt collar adjusted. He moved up the aisle with purpose. Passengers turned to look. A few whispered. Daniel didn't move. Not yet. Charles stopped next to seat 3A, folded his arms, and stared down at Clara. "Let's try this again," he said, quietly but firmly. "I think you owe me an apology." Clara blinked. "Excuse me." "You humiliated me," he said, his voice laced with performative calm. "You made me look like the bad guy in front of an entire cabin, when all I did was try to de-escalate a misunderstanding." She stared at him. "You took my seat." He leaned in too close. "You're a soldier. Aren't you trained to adapt? What difference does a seat make?" Daniel was standing before Clara could even look back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply stood, and the presence of him filled the space like a change in barometric pressure. Charles glanced back and saw him, his bravado faltering just slightly. "You again," he muttered. You just can't help yourself, can you? Daniel's voice was low. Calm. Iron. I'm going to ask you to step away from her. You don't get to, she said. No, Daniel cut in. That should have been the end of it. A few rows down, a passenger pulled out a phone and hit record. Another whispered, "He's doing it again." Charles scoffed. You trying to go viral, pal? Is that it? Play the hero again? You think people are going to remember you? Daniel stepped closer. I don't care if anyone remembers me. But they will remember how they felt when they saw you pick on someone smaller than you. Clara rose to her feet, then not in defense, but in solidarity. This is my seat, she said, her voice unwavering. The issue was already resolved. Please go back to yours. Charles's nostrils flared. He looked from Daniel to Clara, then around the cabin. All eyes were on him now. The narrative had shifted, and he no longer had control of the room. The flight attendant appeared again this time with a man in uniform, the pilot. Captain Collins. Is there a problem here? The pilot asked, stern but composed. Charles tried to answer, but the captain raised a hand to stop him. His eyes locked onto Daniel. Brooks. Daniel turned slightly. Captain Collins. A flicker of recognition passed between them, history compressed into a glance. The captain gave a small nod. Didn't think I'd see you again outside of Afghanistan. Daniel offered a faint smile. Likewise, sir. The pilot looked at Clara. Miss, are you all right? She nodded. Then he looked at Charles. Sir, if this happens again, I'll have to ask you to deboard. We run a zero-tolerance policy for harassment on this airline, regardless of your frequent flyer status. Charles looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. You people. That'll be enough, the pilot said. Return to your seat. Defeated and exposed, Charles turned and stormed back to coach without another word. A beat of silence. Then it happened again, slowly at first, then building applause. Not loud, not raucous, but sincere. A man in row 5 clapped once, then again. A woman in 8A joined in. Someone whistled quietly. Clara looked stunned. Daniel said nothing. Captain Collins gave Daniel a subtle nod before heading back to the cockpit. The flight attendant leaned into Clara and whispered, "Let me know if you need anything, ma'am." And just like that, the air finally shifted this time for good. As Clara sat back down, she turned slightly in her seat and met Daniel's eyes. "Why did you get up again?" she asked. His reply was soft, almost lost in the hum of the engines. Because someone was watching. She followed his gaze to Bella, now wide awake, gripping the armrest, and watching her father like he was the only truth in the world. The cabin had returned to quiet, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was the kind of hush that follows a turning point where every passenger knows they've just witnessed something that mattered. For Clara Donovan, it was more than a reclaimed seat. It was dignity. For Daniel Brooks, it was the quiet satisfaction of standing for something, not because it made a scene, but because it made a difference. And for Bella, still gripping her stuffed bear in row 7, it was a lesson her father hadn't spoken aloud, but had just etched into her heart. The hum of the engines was the only sound for several minutes. Then slowly, Clara rose from her seat and walked down the aisle again. This time, not out of defense, but gratitude. She paused beside Daniel and Bella. Mind if I sit for a minute? Daniel glanced at Bella, who smiled and nodded eagerly. He motioned to the aisle seat. Be my guest. Clara sat straight-backed, still wearing her uniform, still processing. I've handled worse than that guy, she began, almost to herself. Daniel didn't interrupt. I've trained with soldiers twice my size. I've hiked through terrain that chewed up the soles of my boots. I've stood in front of commanders who barely looked me in the eye. And somehow, that man saying I didn't belong in first class rattled me more than all of it. Daniel nodded slowly, his voice even. Because the battlefield you trained for is clear. This one isn't. Clara looked at him intrigued. You speak like someone who's fought both. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the window, though the clouds outside gave nothing away. In the field, he said, you know who the enemy is. You know what the mission is. You know what failure looks like. He turned back to her. But here, in the world, we come home to. The lines are blurred, the wounds are quieter, and sometimes the bullets are words. She let that settle. Daniel leaned back. He didn't attack your seat. He attacked your presence. Clara exhaled. And you stepped in. Daniel's brow furrowed. I stepped in because silence is approval. Then from across the aisle, a voice cut in. It was a man in his 50s, seated in 7B, dressed in a blazer and khakis. He had the look of a university professor composed curious, but with that hint of quiet provocation. Excuse me, the man said, leaning forward. I couldn't help but overhear. May I ask a question? Clara turned slightly. Daniel just raised an eyebrow. The man continued. I'm not disagreeing with your actions. But don't you think there's a risk in turning every rude interaction into a stage? Daniel tilted his head. You think I was performing? Not necessarily. But public confrontation always carries consequences. Sometimes letting things slide avoids escalation. Daniel smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind that reached his eyes. Do you have children, sir? The man blinked. Yes. 2. Daniel pointed gently to Bella. So do I. The professor looked at the girl who waved politely. And when she asked me why no one helped, Daniel continued, what would you have had me say? That it's better to stay quiet. That dignity is only worth protecting if it's convenient. The man hesitated. Daniel's voice dropped gentle but unyielding. I don't teach her how to pick a fight. I teach her how to see one that's already been started and how to choose whether to walk away or walk through it. Clara looked between the two men. The professor nodded slowly. I see your point. But you're right, Daniel added. Confrontation carries risk, which is exactly why so few people take it. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Charles Hale sat with his arms crossed, headphones in but nothing playing. He stared at the tray table in front of him, like it had betrayed him. He had always known how to command attention in boardrooms, in negotiations, even in restaurants, where his name brought a better table. But today, he'd been outmaneuvered by a man who hadn't raised his voice. What stung wasn't the loss of the seat. It was the applause. The ripple of support that didn't go to him that went to the soldier he mocked and the stranger who called him out. Who was that man, he wondered? How did he know what to say? And when to say it? Charles clenched his jaw. He didn't like being the villain, especially not in public. And yet deep down beneath the layers of pride, something in him whispered, you were. Back in row 7, the conversation continued. Passengers nearby listened with open ears, but respectful silence. Clara turned toward Daniel again. Can I ask, what was your rank? Daniel hesitated. Captain. Delta Force. Retired after my daughter was born. Clara's eyes widened. Delta. He nodded. She sat back, quietly impressed. No wonder you were so calm under fire. He chuckled. That wasn't fire. That was theater. They both laughed, and the tension between them cracked like thawing ice. Clara tilted her head. You always talk like that. Like every word is a measured truth. Daniel shrugged. Old habit. People listen better when you don't shout. Bella chimed in, then her voice small but clear. Daddy says words are like arrows. Clara turned, smiling. Oh yeah. How so? Bella beamed. If you throw them wild, they hurt people. But if you aim them right, they make people stop and think. Clara blinked, touched. Daniel squeezed his daughter's hand. She's got a better head than most adults I know. Clara nodded, deeply. Moved. She's lucky to have you. Daniel looked down for a moment. I'm the lucky one. As the flight attendants rolled the cart past, Clara stood up. I should get back to my seat. But, she paused. Thank you again. Daniel nodded. Any time, soldier. Clara smiled, and as she walked back to 3A, the passengers who had once remained silent now offered her warm nods, soft smiles, quiet acknowledgments that respect, once restored, changes everyone. She sat down, but this time, she did so, like she belonged there. Because she did. And someone had reminded everyone of that truth, not with anger, but with calm conviction. The hum of the jet engines lulled the cabin into a strange serenity, like a held breath after a storm. Tray tables were down. Drinks clinked gently. Somewhere up front, a baby gave a soft whimper, but was soon quieted. Clara Donovan sat in 3A, finally able to breathe again, but her mind hadn't yet caught up with her body. The man who had stood for her, Daniel Brooks, hadn't just diffused a confrontation. He had redirected it with precision, like a veteran tracing bullet paths through silence. There was something almost surgical in his calm, the way his presence drew gravity from the air without demanding it. She reached for her carry-on and pulled out a small notebook. Her father, General Blake Donovan, had given it to her when she first deployed, filled with his own scrawled notes from 30 years of service. At the top of the first page, he had written in all caps, "Judge less. Listen more. Never mistake noise for leadership." Today, Daniel had done exactly that. Without a rank on his shoulder or a title to flash, he'd commanded a cabin full of strangers better than some men did on parade grounds. She flipped a page and wrote quietly, "The man in row 7C. Quiet. Calm. Not loud, but heard. Whoever he is, he's not done being a soldier." Then she froze mid-sentence, pen hovering. Brooks. Daniel Brooks. She knew that name. It rang like an echo from deep memory from one of her father's old stories, half told between IV drips and painkillers, when he still had the strength to talk. She remembered it now. Brooks. Kandahar. The extraction mission. Clara's heart began to pound. Back in row 7C, Daniel stretched his legs slightly, careful not to disturb Bella, who was now curled up beside him, dozing off with her drawing book on her lap. Her tiny fingers still held onto the bear she never flew without. Daniel glanced at the passengers around him, many pretending to sleep, some half watching a movie. Most avoided eye contact, but he noticed a change. The tension that had existed when they boarded, that simmering discomfort, was gone. And in its place, respect, not spoken, not clapped for, but felt. The flight attendant returned her tray of drinks, half emptied, a tired but genuine smile on her face. "Sir," she said softly, "would you mind stepping into the galley for just a moment? The captain asked to speak with you." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I assume it's not about turbulence," he said dryly. She smiled wider. "Not unless you count moral turbulence." He chuckled, then gently nudged Bella awake. "Stay in your seat, Munchkin. I'll be right back." She yawned and nodded, her eyes already drifting closed again. The galley was quiet and narrow, the soft buzz of machinery the only sound. Captain Collins stood near the coffee station, his pilot hat tucked under one arm. When Daniel entered, the captain straightened slightly, eyes scanning him the way only someone trained in life or death details could do. "Still wearing green, I see," Collins said. Daniel gave a half smile. "It's not regulation anymore." The captain stepped forward and extended a hand. "Daniel Brooks. I'll be damned. Never thought I'd see you on my flight." Daniel shook his hand, firm and warm. "Never thought I'd need to intervene on a commercial jet, but here we are." Collins leaned against the galley wall, his voice quiet and weighted. You saved my life once. Kandahar. You probably don't even remember. Daniel blinked. East wall breach. Collins nodded. That's the one. I remember. You were the one who dragged 2 of our men back behind the barrier while under mortar fire. Only made it back because of you. You stayed out there longer than anyone should have. Daniel shook his head. Just long enough. Collins looked him dead in the eye. You still doing that, huh? Just long enough to make a difference. Daniel didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Back in her seat, Clara was staring at her phone. She had sent a single text to her father, not expecting a quick reply, knowing how weak he'd been this week. Dad, does the name Daniel Brooks mean anything to you? A minute passed, then 2. Then the screen lit up. Is he there? Yes. Tell him. I never forgot Kabul. Her heart caught in her throat. Then another message appeared. Tell him I owe him more than my life. Tell him I owe him the man I became. She stared at those words, her hands trembling slightly. Then she rose from her seat. The cockpit door cracked open gently, and Clara's voice came through. Captain Collins looked over. Yes, Lieutenant. I need to speak with Mr. Brooks. Daniel turned, curious. Clara stepped into the galley, closing the small door behind her. For a moment, the 3 of them stood in the quiet hum of the sky, as though in a confessional above the clouds. I sent a message to my father, she said softly. Daniel's expression changed. Blake. She nodded. He replied. She swallowed. He said he owes you more than his life. He said he owes you the man he became. Daniel looked down, visibly moved. His throat tightened before he could speak. Captain Collins stepped back respectfully, leaving them a moment of privacy. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. You didn't just serve under my father, did you? Daniel met her gaze. No. He saved my life once, and in return, I saved his. She smiled. I guess that makes us even. Daniel shook his head. No, Lieutenant. It means we're still in the same fight, the one for dignity, for decency, for those who can't always speak for themselves. She nodded slowly. Then she extended her hand. Thank you, Captain Brooks. He smiled faintly and shook it. For what? For reminding the rest of this plane who the real first class is. As they stepped back into the cabin, Daniel paused near Bella. She looked up at him groggily. Everything okay, Daddy? He smiled. Better than okay, sweetheart. Clara stood beside them for a moment longer, then returned to her seat. Passengers watched her with new awareness, not just as a woman in uniform, but as someone who had been seen defended and now recognized. As for Charles Hale, he remained in his seat, eyes fixed forward, face unreadable. But he had heard the name, Daniel Brooks, and now he knew some men didn't need medals or suits to command a room. They just needed to stand up when no one else would. For the first time since the plane left, the ground, Clara Donovan felt still. Not because the turbulence had passed, but because something inside her had finally settled. She sat back in 3A, the same seat that had once been the epicenter of humiliation, and now felt like a silent monument to dignity. The same passengers who had once looked through her were now stealing glances of admiration, curiosity, maybe even quiet respect. She didn't need their praise, but she could feel the shift. And it wasn't just because of her. It was because of the man who had stood behind her quietly, calmly like a wall no storm could move. Daniel Brooks. She turned slightly and looked down the aisle toward row 7C. He wasn't looking at her. He was listening to his daughter talk about clouds. I think that one looks like a turtle, Bella said, pointing at the window. Daniel smiled. I was going to say it looks like a slice of pie. Bella scrunched her nose. Daddy, clouds can't be pie. They can if you're really hungry. She giggled and leaned her head against his shoulder. It was such a simple moment. And yet to Clara, it carried the same weight as a battlefield truce. The kind of moment where peace wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of understanding. She stood up again, not because she needed to, but because something in her told her this conversation wasn't over. Back in row 7, Daniel looked up as Clara approached. "Hope I'm not disturbing," she said softly. "Not at all," he replied, shifting slightly. "Bella, this is Lieutenant Donovan." Bella looked up at Clara and gave a shy wave. "Are you the soldier lady?" Clara smiled. "That's me. Daddy said you're really brave." Clara knelt slightly to meet Bella's eye level. "I think your dad's the brave one," Bella shrugged. "He just says what people forget to." Clara looked at Daniel, who offered a modest shrug. "I think she gets it," he said. Clara stood up again and leaned slightly on the armrest between them. "I wanted to ask you something, off the record." Daniel tilted his head. "Go on. Why did you stop wearing the uniform?" It wasn't an accusation, it was a sincere question. A soldier asking another who had clearly seen and done more than most. Daniel paused. His gaze drifted toward the ceiling, as if he were flipping through mental photographs. "I wore it for 17 years, he said, finally. "Through sandstorms, through cities we couldn't pronounce, through missions no one will ever read about." Clara waited. But when I came home, it was Bella who needed me in a different uniform. One with pancake batter stains and hands that held instead of saluted. Clara smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes too. "You never missed it every day," he said without hesitation. "But I don't regret it." There was silence between them for a moment, not awkward, but full. Then Clara leaned in slightly. "My dad always said real leaders don't need to shout. They just make people feel safer by being in the room." Daniel looked at her curious. "He said that after Kabul," she added. "I think he was talking about you." Daniel's expression softened. "He made me believe in honor again. He taught me that leadership wasn't about giving orders. It was about knowing when to speak and when to let others step forward." She nodded. "He's not as strong now, but he still talks like a general. He always will." Bella, now quietly doodling again, looked up. "Will your dad get better?" Clara knelt beside her again. "He's trying. He misses the field. But I think he just misses the people more." Bella nodded seriously. "My daddy misses people too. Especially Uncle Jack. He was his best friend. He didn't come home." Clara looked at Daniel. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened slightly. "He was one of ours," Daniel said quietly. "The kind of guy who'd take a bullet before asking someone else to do the hard part." "I'm sorry," Clara said. Daniel looked at his daughter. "She only knows the stories, not the loss. And I plan to keep it that way, for as long as I can." Clara placed a hand on the seat in front of her. "You're doing a good job, Daniel." "More than you know." He didn't respond right away. Then, with a half smile, "I'm trying." The plane jolted slightly, a pocket of turbulence, and the overhead chime echoed through the cabin. Seatbelt signs lit up again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came a voice through the speakers. "We're beginning our initial descent into Boston Logan International Airport. Please return to your seats and ensure your belts are fastened." Clara returned to 3A and buckled in. Daniel checked on Bella, who was already belted, and now watching the clouds shift into sea below. "You think we'll see snow?" she asked. "Maybe," Daniel said. "But if not, there'll be Coco waiting." She smiled and leaned into his side again. As the plane dipped lower through the atmosphere, Clara stared out the window, the lights of Boston flickering like memories waiting to be relived. And then, for the first time, she realized something. She hadn't felt this grounded in a long time, not on solid earth, but in the sky, in a tin can with recycled air, crammed luggage strangers, and coughs, and yet something had happened here that mattered. She took out her phone and opened the last message from her father again. "Tell him I never forgot Kabul." Then she typed back, "He remembers. And he's still fighting just differently now." The message sent, and her eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. Back in row 7, Daniel sat quietly holding Bella's hand as the plane made its final approach. He glanced at Clara one more time. She looked forward strong, composed, but there was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there before. And in that moment, Daniel knew. He hadn't just helped a stranger reclaim her seat. He had helped another soldier reclaim her voice. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a soft thud, followed by the familiar crescendo of reverse thrusters and the metallic groan of flaps shifting beneath the cabin. Outside, Logan Airport shimmered beneath the glow of evening lights. Raindrops gathered on the window panes, like tiny reminders that the world below was real again. Seatbelts clicked, bodies shifted. The passengers re-entered gravity, not just physical, but emotional. The weight of everything that had happened in the last 2 hours settling in. But for Daniel, Brooke's gravity had never left. He sat in 7C with his shoulders relaxed, one arm gently around Bella, who had begun to stir. In his mind, though, he wasn't at Logan. Not yet. He was somewhere else, a different landing, a different flight. Kabul, 2009. It was late, and the base had been under blackout for nearly 12 hours. 2 Black Hawks grounded comms compromised, and the ridge lit with muzzle flashes every few minutes. They were pinned down near the southern barracks when the order came through extraction in 20. Daniel was the last one out of the blast zone, dragging a wounded corporal and covering fire for the rest. He remembered thinking he wouldn't make it out, until someone stood up, not from command, not from cover, but from inside the chaos. General Blake Donovan. He hadn't needed to be there, but he was. Firing, shouting orders, dragging men into safety, not with rank, but with grit. And then, in the final sprint to the perimeter, Donovan had grabbed Daniel by the collar and thrown him onto the last evac vehicle, like a father throwing his son out of a burning building. Daniel never saw him again after that night. Until now, in the face of a daughter, Daddy Bella whispered, pulling him gently back to the present. "Are we here?" "We are, sweetheart," he said, smoothing her hair. "Welcome to Boston." Up front, Clara Donovan gathered her bag from under the seat, her mind still looping with images, the confrontation, the recognition her father's reply to her message. I never forgot Kabul. It had been years since she heard him mention Kabul aloud. She always assumed the war lived in him quietly, like a scar under pressed shirts. But now she realized it hadn't just shaped him, it had saved him. And the man responsible had been seated just behind her, this entire flight, wearing a worn green jacket, and the look of someone who no longer needed medals to feel worthy. As the line of passengers began to shuffle down the aisle, Clara waited by the exit, letting others move first. She wasn't ready to leave yet, not without saying something more. Daniel stood lifting Bella's small backpack with one hand and holding her hand with the other. As he stepped into the aisle, Clara turned to face him. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her, and for a brief second, the background noise of the cabin seemed to dim. "I've a feeling my father would want to see you." Daniel hesitated. Clara continued, "I'm heading to the VA hospital. He's been there since last week. If you're not in a rush." He looked down at Bella, who blinked up at him. "You okay if we make one more stop before the hotel?" he asked her gently. Bella nodded. "Will there be cocoa?" Clara smiled. "There's a vending machine in the lobby with cocoa packets. I'll cover it." Daniel chuckled. "Well then, that's a deal breaker." The ride from Logan to the VA hospital was quiet but comfortable. Clara drove. Daniel sat in the passenger seat. Bella curled up in the back, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. The radio played old country tunes, the kind Daniel never admitted he liked. Clara broke the silence first. My father used to tell this story about a mission gone sideways. He'd say, there was one man who didn't run when the ridge went red. One man who stayed to make sure the last kid out was breathing. Daniel said nothing, but his hand gripped the armrest lightly. He never said your name, she added. I think that was his way of protecting it. Like if he said it aloud, it would make the memory too fragile. Daniel exhaled slowly. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct and a little anger. We lost good men that day. Clara glanced at him. He said losing them is what turned him into a better general. Daniel looked out the window. Sometimes grief is a better teacher than glory. She nodded, eyes misting slightly. And sometimes silence is how warriors say thank you. The VA hospital stood tall but tired, the kind of building that tried to look new through fresh paint, even as its bones sagged with memory. They walked in together, the three of them, down the echoing hallway. The receptionist didn't ask questions when Clara gave her name. She knew who General Donovan was. Everyone here did. Room 214. Clara knocked gently, then opened the door. Inside, Blake Donovan sat propped up in a hospital bed, pale but alert, an IV trailing from his arm. His face still held the steel of command, even as age and illness softened the edges. His eyes lifted when he saw his daughter. Then, they found Daniel. And for a moment, the world stopped. The general's lips parted. His voice was hoarse but firm. Brooks. Daniel stepped in, removed his cap. Sir. There were no salutes, just silence. And then Blake Donovan smiled. I was wondering when you'd stop avoiding me. Daniel chuckled, but there was emotion behind it. Took a little girl in a plane ride to corner me, sir. The general motioned him closer. Daniel approached, and Blake reached out not for a handshake, but a firm clasp of the arm, soldier to soldier. You never owed me anything, Blake said quietly. Daniel replied just as softly, but you gave me everything. They locked eyes, two men who had walked the same fires, bled the same dirt, carried the same ghosts. Clara stood by the doorway, her heart full, her past, rewritten in real time. Bella tiptoed closer, tugged Daniel's sleeve, then looked at the general. Hi, she said cheerfully. I'm Bella. My daddy helped the soldier lady. Blake chuckled a genuine raspy laugh. That sounds about right. Then he looked at Daniel. She's beautiful. She saved me, Daniel said. And no one in the room doubted he meant it. Room 214 had grown still, not with awkwardness, but with reverence. The kind of stillness that settles between men who no longer need to speak every truth aloud, because they've already lived it. Daniel Brooks sat beside General Blake Donovan, both men leaning slightly forward. Forearms resting on knees, the way soldiers do when conversations turn serious. Clara stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her, quietly, watching the two men who had shaped her life from opposite directions. And near the window, Bella perched on the edge of a visitor's chair, legs swinging stuffed bear in her lap, small fingers tracing its stitched paws as she listened, eyes wide open. Her father had taught her how to be quiet when it mattered, but no one had ever taught her how to stay quiet when something needed saying. She had her own code for that. One hand up, a breath in. Then, speak. Excuse me, Bella piped up, tilting her head toward General Donovan. The three adults turned. Blake smiled gently. Yes, sweetheart. Can I ask you a question? You sure can. She looked at her father briefly, then back at the general. Do you know why my dad helped the lady on the plane? Clara blinked, caught off guard. Blake leaned back slightly. I can guess, but I'd rather hear your answer. Bella nodded seriously, hugging her bear tighter. Because he told me once that if you see someone getting picked on and you stay quiet, then you're letting the bad guys think it's okay. The room fell quiet again. Daniel's throat tightened. He hadn't remembered telling her that, not in words so clear. But now that he heard it spoken aloud in her soft and serious voice, it hit harder than any lesson he'd ever taught. General Donovan smiled, his eyes shimmering. That's a very wise thing for a young lady to say. Bella nodded again, as if she were just stating the obvious. Clara stepped forward, her voice soft. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. Bella glanced up at her. Were you scared? Clara paused. Then honestly, yes. But you didn't look scared. Clara smiled. That's because your dad made me feel safe. Bella beamed. He does that. Daniel cleared his throat gently, rubbing the back of his neck. All right now, don't go inflating my ego in front of a 4-star general. Blake let out a dry chuckle. Too late for that, Brooks. You're already 10 feet tall in this room. Then his gaze softened as he looked between the three of them. Funny how it works, isn't it? The people we try to protect sometimes end up being the ones who keep us going. Clara's voice lowered. I think I forgot that for a while. Blake studied his daughter, the edges of command still in his posture, but fatherhood softening the words. You didn't forget. You just needed a reminder. And sometimes reminders come in the form of old ghosts or 9-year-old girls. Bella giggled. Daniel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She's taught me more about patience than the battlefield ever did. Children have a way of holding up mirrors, Blake said, showing us what kind of man we are and what kind we want to be. Then his breath hitched slightly, and Clara moved instinctively toward his side. You okay, Dad? He nodded slowly. Just tired. But good. Tired. Daniel stood, sensing it was time to leave. But as he reached for Bella's hand, Blake extended his own toward him again. Not a handshake this time, but a firm clasp of the forearm. Thank you, the general said. Daniel met his eyes. You said I didn't owe you anything. You don't. But I still owe you a thank you. Not just for Kabul, but for my daughter. Clara looked between them, her throat tightening. Blake added, voice raspy. There are moments a father wishes he could protect his child from the world. And then there are moments he realizes the world still holds men like you in it. Daniel looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. I just did what was right. Blake shook his head. No. You did what was brave. And more than that, you did it in front of your daughter. He looked at Bella, who smiled and gave a proud little wave. Keep her close, Blake said. That kind of light. You don't get twice in a lifetime. Daniel nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I know. Outside the hospital room, the hallway echoed with the distant beeps of machines and the soft squeaks of nurses' shoes. Clara walked Daniel and Bella to the lobby. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, but the air somehow felt warmer now, not sterile, but settled. Thank you, Clara said again, her voice quiet. Daniel looked at her. For what? For everything. For what you did on that plane. For showing me who you were without ever needing to say it. He offered a small, almost shy smile. Sometimes, the only time people listen is when you're not trying to be heard. She studied him. I'd like my dad to see you again. Maybe next week. He doesn't say it out loud, but I think today gave him strength. Daniel looked at Bella, who was now standing at the vending machine peering into the cocoa selection with intense seriousness. I'd like that, he said. Clara smiled. Let me know when works for you. He nodded. Then, as she turned to leave, Bella called out, Miss Clara! Clara turned. Bella ran up and wrapped her arms around Clara's waist. Clara froze for just a second, then knelt and hugged her tightly back. "You were really brave," Bella whispered. Clara felt something warm break open in her chest. Not pain, not grief. Healing. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." As Bella ran back to Daniel, Clara stood watching them, father and daughter, walking hand in hand toward the exit, quiet and simple, like any other parent and child. But to her, they were extraordinary. The next morning, a soft fog blanketed the outskirts of Boston. It clung low to the pavement, coating the streets in a gentle hush that made even the busiest roads feel sacred. At a modest coffee shop, 2 blocks from the VA hospital, the kind with scratched wooden booths, handwritten chalkboard menus, and the faint smell of cinnamon baked into the walls. Clara Donovan sat alone with a steaming mug between her palms. She wasn't in uniform today. No pressed jacket, no polished boots, just a gray sweater jeans and a quiet nervousness in her chest that had nothing to do with caffeine. She kept checking the door, and then it opened. Daniel Brooks stepped in, holding the door open behind him for Bella, who marched in proudly with a chocolate muffin nearly the size of her face. Clara stood instinctively and smiled. "You made it." Daniel nodded. Wasn't going to miss this. Bella ran over and gave Clara a quick side hug before hopping into the booth. "Miss Clara." They had muffins and cocoa with marshmallows. They even let me pick 2 extra marshmallows. That never happens. Clara grinned. "Clearly you have a powerful presence." Daniel sat across from her, his face calm but alert, always alert. Even in a cozy coffee shop with Christmas lights strung across the windows, he scanned his surroundings with the ease of someone trained, never to relax completely. Clara handed him a menu, though she already knew he wasn't the type to take long. "You sure he's up for visitors today?" Daniel asked, glancing at Bella with a protective eye. Clara nodded. "Dad's more lucid in the mornings. I think he's been waiting for this." Daniel studied her face. "You sure you're up for it?" She gave a soft laugh. "That's the thing about growing up with a general. You're always up for it whether you are or not." He smiled at that. The waitress came by, took their orders, black coffee for Daniel, scrambled eggs for Bella, oatmeal and fruit for Clara, and then disappeared back behind the counter. For a moment, the 3 of them sat in a silence that didn't need breaking. Then Clara leaned in. "There's something I didn't get to tell you yesterday," she said. "Something my father told me after you left." Daniel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Clara continued. "He said there were 3 men in his entire career who changed him. Not the kind of change that shows up in reports. The kind that stays with you after retirement, after the war, after the medals." She paused. "You were one of them." Daniel looked down, his fingers gently wrapping around his coffee cup. "He said the way you carried wounded men to safety in Kabul, the way you refused to leave the last man behind, even when the second chopper was already in the air. It made him realize leadership wasn't about being first to shout. It was about being last to leave." Daniel took a breath. "That night." "I thought we were all going to die." Clara nodded. "He did too." Then her voice dropped. "He said, if I ever found you, I should tell you something." She pulled a small envelope from her bag and handed it to him. Daniel looked at it. His name was scrawled on the front in bold, slightly shaky handwriting. "Brooks." He opened it slowly, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. Clara didn't interrupt as he read. "Daniel, you saved my life in Kabul. But more than that, you saved my sense of honor. You reminded me that quiet courage doesn't get parades, but it changes the world. I saw you then. I see you now. You've become the man I always hoped my daughter would meet, not because of your rank, but because of your integrity. If you're reading this, it means she's safe in your company. And that means I can rest easy. With all the respect one soldier can give another Blake." Donovan Daniel folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope. His eyes were moist, but steady. Bella, watching quietly, reached over and placed her hand on his. "Are you okay, Daddy?" He nodded. "Yeah, sweet pea. Just remembering some important things." Clara wiped at her own eyes and gave a soft smile. "He's never written anything like that to anyone. Not even me." Daniel chuckled through a thick breath. "He still outranks me in sentiment. Then, after a pause, I'd like to see him again." He's waiting. Back at the hospital, General Donovan's room was brighter than the day before. Someone had opened the blinds. A nurse had left a small poinsettia on the windowsill, and there was music playing softly on a radio, old jazz, the kind he used to dance to with Clara's mother before the deployment started stacking up like dominoes. When Daniel entered with Bella holding his hand, Blake looked up with a smile already forming. "You found the place," the general rasped. Daniel stepped forward. Wasn't too hard. Clara left a trail of cocoa wrappers and valor. Blake laughed, then motioned toward the chair. "Sit, sit." "You too, young lady." Bella climbed into the chair beside him without hesitation. "I brought you something," she said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from her backpack. It was a crayon drawing Daniel, Bella, and Clara standing in front of a big heart. A plane floated above them with smiley faces in the windows. Blake took it with reverent hands. "Is that me in the bed?" he asked, pointing to the figure in the corner. Bella nodded proudly. "You're smiling because you feel better." The general looked at Daniel, then back at the drawing. "You know, he said I've had medals pinned to my chest, but I think this might be my favorite decoration." Daniel smiled. "She's got a good eye for what matters." Blake folded the drawing carefully and placed it on the table beside his watch and dog tags. "Daniel," he said quietly, "when I'm gone, men like you are what's left of our legacy." Daniel shook his head. "I'm just a father now, a mechanic, a quiet man." Blake leaned forward, strength flickering behind the illness. "That's exactly what makes you dangerous to the darkness. You don't need to raise your voice. You are the voice." They looked at each other, two soldiers who'd aged on separate paths, but met again at the same mile marker of meaning. And between them, a little girl drew rainbows on a bedside napkin while humming softly to the jazz. The hospital room was quieter now. Bella had fallen asleep in the corner chair, her crayon still clutched in one hand, her drawing of the three heroes and a plane lying on the tray table beside her. The soft jazz from the radio continued to hum gently through the space, like a lullaby for memory. Clara had stepped out briefly to take a call. That left the two men, General Blake Donovan and Daniel Brooks, alone in the room for the first time. And in that silence, the conversation they had both carried for over a decade finally found room to breathe. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on knees, his hands clasped. Blake sat up with effort, his breathing labored but determined. The frailty of age sat on his body, but the fire of command still burned behind his eyes. "You haven't changed much," Blake said. Daniel gave a half smile. "Neither have you, sir. You're just more horizontal now." Blake chuckled, then coughed. "Yeah, well, these days gravity wins every battle." Daniel's smile faded into something gentler. "I almost didn't come, you know, after all these years, after Kabul, after disappearing." "I know," Blake said quietly. "I didn't expect you to." Daniel hesitated. "I didn't leave because I was bitter. I left because I didn't know how to stay." Blake nodded slowly. "Most good soldiers don't." Daniel's voice dropped. "I was angry for a long time, not at you. At the silence, at the faces I kept seeing every time I closed my eyes, at how easy it was to come home and feel invisible." Blake looked at him with something close to grief. "I felt it too. Every morning I woke up and didn't smell sand or hear static. I wondered if I was dreaming. They sat with that truth for a moment. The kind that only veterans understand, where peace feels unnatural and survival feels like betrayal. Daniel finally asked, "Did it ever get easier for you?" Blake shook his head. "No." But it got clearer. Daniel looked over. Blake continued. "The pain never left. But I started learning what to do with it. I wrote letters I never sent. I planted tomatoes. I built furniture with my bare hands just so I could control something. And I raised Clara the only way I knew how, by preparing her for a world that doesn't always see women in uniform." Daniel exhaled slowly. "You did a good job. She's one of the strongest people I've ever met." Blake smiled, pride softening his face. "She's got her mother's fire. My stubbornness. Dangerous combo." A pause. Then Daniel said quietly, "She reminds me of someone I once trained. Same drive, same precision. Except Clara's got one thing I didn't expect." "What's that?" Blake asked. "Mercy." Blake nodded slowly. "That's because she had to fight in places men never see: boardrooms, barracks, back seats of Humvees, where jokes turned into warnings. She's forged from fire, but she's chosen to carry water." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I don't know if I could have done what she did on that plane." "Stay calm. Hold the line without throwing a punch." Blake smirked. "You held the line by standing. That's what made the punch unnecessary." There was a quiet moment between them. Then Blake turned, slightly, his face more serious. "Tell me the truth, Daniel. Why did you step in?" Daniel looked him in the eye. "Because she reminded me of me, back then. When I was new green, full of rules and fear. I watched a man try to rob her of her place in front of everyone. And I remembered what that felt like. I remembered the first time someone called me boy in front of a colonel, and no one said a word. I remembered how that silence ate at me longer than the insult." His voice tightened. "I didn't want Bella to watch that happen and think it was okay." Blake nodded, his throat moving as he swallowed hard. "You didn't just protect Clara. You taught your daughter something men like us took years to learn." Daniel's jaw tensed. "I just don't want her to grow up learning how to be tough. I want her to grow up learning how to be true." The general smiled slowly. "And that's why I trust her with you." Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" Blake looked out the window for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm tired, Brooks. More than I let on. My body's giving up long before my mind is ready. But I've made peace with that. What I haven't made peace with is leaving Clara without someone who sees her, not just the soldier, but the daughter." Daniel sat back, uncertain. Blake turned to him. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are. But I've watched the way you move, the way you speak, the way your daughter looks at you like the world makes sense because you're in it." He paused. "And I want Clara to have someone like that, not to save her, but to stand with her." Daniel's voice was quiet. "She doesn't need saving." Blake smiled. "I know. That's what makes her worthy of you." Daniel looked away, the weight of those words crashing into him like a slow tide. He didn't answer. Not yet. Some truths are too sacred for quick responses. A moment later, Clara re-entered the room with a small coffee tray in hand. "I thought I'd bring reinforcements," she said lightly, handing her father a cup. Blake took it, still watching Daniel with a quiet knowing. Clara glanced between them. "Everything okay?" Blake nodded. "Just two old soldiers swapping scars." Daniel stood adjusting Bella's jacket as she stirred awake. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. Clara gave a small smile. "Thank you for yesterday." Blake took a slow sip. "Don't be a stranger, Brooks." Daniel met his eyes. "I won't." As Daniel turned to leave with Bella's hand in his, Clara watched him, really watched him, and something in her heart shifted. He didn't just walk like a man who had seen war. He walked like a man who had chosen peace every day since. And somehow, she felt safer, knowing he existed in the same world. 3 weeks later, Boston Logan International Airport hummed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage loudspeaker announcements and the subdued rustle of travel-bound humanity. But at gate B-22, something different stirred. A small group had begun to gather, not for a boarding call, but for a ceremony. Unofficial, unscheduled, but deeply personal. Among the onlookers were Veterans Airline staff and a few passengers who recognized the names whispered in the press earlier that week. The soldier, in Seat 3A, the veteran in green, and the flight that went silent for the right reasons. The story had spread, not because someone tried to make it viral, but because a flight attendant had quietly posted about it on her Facebook page, a story about a man who stood up without anger, a little girl who reminded everyone what courage looked like, and a soldier who reclaimed her seat. And something more. People shared it, because it mattered. And now gathered near a gate that looked like any other, the people were waiting. Daniel Brooks stood near the podium dressed in a dark charcoal jacket over his usual forest green shirt. The fabric was newer than his old military coat, but beneath it was the same quiet strength. He didn't like attention, but today wasn't about him. Beside him, Bella wore a small white dress with a blue ribbon around her waist, holding a bouquet of paper flowers. She'd folded herself, one for every soldier her father ever told her about. Each one had a name written inside. Some were names he'd whispered, others he'd never said aloud, but she knew. And standing across from them was Clara Donovan, now in full uniform medals, polished posture, firm but eyes soft. Her father wasn't there in person. General Blake Donovan had passed away peacefully 6 days earlier, but he was there in spirit, in purpose, and in the letter he'd left behind. Read by Clara at the private funeral. Dignity doesn't come from rank. It comes from remembering who you stood for when no one was looking. Today she was standing for him, and with someone he once called the finest soldier I ever met, who never asked for recognition. The airline had offered to host the moment at the gate, honoring both veterans quietly. No media, no fanfare, just a gesture. But the passengers who heard what was happening chose to stay. Some wiped their eyes. Others stood with hands behind their backs in quiet civilian salute. The airport PA system clicked, and the flight attendant's voice came over gently nervous. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment before boarding Flight 217 today, newly designated the Flight of Hope, to recognize 2 passengers whose story reminded us all what honor, courage, and kindness look like at 30,000 feet. She paused, breath shaky. Today we honor Staff Sergeant Clara Donovan and Captain Daniel Brooks, not only for their service, but for reminding this country that dignity is not just earned in battlefields, but defended in aisle seats. A ripple of respectful applause followed. No shouting, no whistles, just the kind of clapping that sounds like gratitude. Clara stepped forward. She wasn't holding a script. She wasn't reading a statement. She just spoke. I didn't expect to be here. Not like this. But life and loss has a way of pushing us into spaces we never saw coming. Her voice cracked gently, but she held. 3 weeks ago, I boarded a flight with a gift from my father, a seat in first class. I thought it was just a comfort. What I didn't know was that he was giving me something much deeper. A reminder. She turned to Daniel. He gave me you. Daniel looked down, emotion pulling at the corners of his eyes. Clara continued. I was tested that day, not by violence, but by humiliation, the kind of subtle public diminishment that makes you question if you belong. And then a man stood up, not to fight, not to shame, but to restore. She turned back to the crowd. We talk about courage like it's only loud, but sometimes it's quiet. It's the man in the green jacket who teaches his daughter that silence in the face of wrong is still wrong. It's a little girl who asks the questions adults are too afraid to ask. She looked at Bella. And it's the father who stands, so his daughter learns when to stand. Bella smiled, and Daniel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Clara cleared her throat. My father is gone. But he died, knowing something few commanders ever do, that his legacy would live on in the hands of someone who never asked for credit. She reached into her pocket and unfolded a small piece of fabric, a patch. The Delta Force emblem faded, but intact. She walked toward Daniel and placed it gently in his hand. He wanted you to have this, she said. Daniel stared at it, lips parted, but words failing him. I can't, he said softly. That belongs to Clara, cut and firm but kind. It belongs to the man who reminded me why we serve, and who taught my father that sometimes the quietest soldier carries the deepest command. Daniel looked at the patch, then at Bella, then back at Clara, and for once, just once, he let the tears fall. Not because he was broken, but because something had finally healed. They boarded Flight 217 together, Clara in 3A, Daniel and Bella in 7C and 7D. But halfway through the flight, the attendants came by and whispered something to Daniel. He hesitated, then nodded. A few minutes later, passengers looked up as Clara stood from her seat, and Daniel took the one beside her. Bella remained in row 7, chatting happily with an elderly woman beside her, showing off her paper flower bouquet. Daniel sat beside Clara, looking slightly uncomfortable in the spotlight, but deeply at peace. You didn't have to give up your seat, he said. Clara smiled, eyes forward. Neither did you. But you did. And that's why this matters. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the clouds drift past the window. Then Clara turned to him. My father always said we spend too much time chasing medals, and not enough time earning moments. Daniel looked at her eyes, tired but warm. I think this was one of them. She nodded. The best ones never come with applause. They clinked their plastic coffee cups gently in a quiet toast. To Hope she whispered. To the quiet ones, he replied. Outside, the clouds parted, and the sunlight broke through, not just onto the wings of the aircraft, but onto 2 soldiers seated side by side. No cameras, no orders, no noise. Just a flight once ordinary, now the flight of hope. Final message. Some stories end with medals, ceremonies, or monuments, but the most important ones, they end with a child watching her father stand and learning that courage is silent, steady, and kind. We'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. It always warms our hearts to see how far stories like this can travel. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of dignity, kindness, or the quiet strength of good people, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share real feeling stories that uplift, heal, and restore a little faith in the world. And to every single one of you who stayed with us until the end, thank you. Your time is precious, and we're honored you chose to spend part of it with us. Until next time, take care of yourself, and keep spreading kindness one quiet moment at a time.